Me mihi aho e te mana whenua o Taranaki, ara ko Taranaki te maunga, ko te tairehua te moana me waiwaki iho te awa. No Uropi me Enarangi o Kutipuna, ko Ngāti Pākehā te iwi, ko Bijou te whānau, ko Denise tēnei. Haere mai ki te hui nei, nā reira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome to today's webinar, everybody. My name is Denise Bijou. It's really nice to have you here with us this morning. Today we're talking about power and participation in community-led change. Yes, power and participation. It's often the elephant in the room. We need to talk about it more, and so that's what we're going to do today, thinking about who's got it, who hasn't, and how do we use it authentically to enable more inclusive engagement, participation and action taking in community change efforts. So this morning we're going to explore some of the big issues relating to power and participation and share examples of communities and organisations actively finding new ways to bring forward local voices, the voices that might not often be heard perhaps as well. Community solutions, we're looking at solutions as well, and te tiriti informed futures. I'm so looking forward to it, really looking forward to talking with these people who are going to introduce themselves in a moment. Just before we do that though, I want to just remind you about Paradigm, Inspiring Communities consultancy arm. I'll tell you a little bit more about that. This is the kind of ways of working that we want to work with. We are working in Paradigm. So let's meet the panelists. Kia ora, Lizzie Makaleo from Wesley Community Action, sharing examples both from People's Voice and People. Really lovely to see you this morning, Lizzie. Please introduce yourself. Pop yourself off mute, sweet.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me?
Ka pai.
Kia ora koutou katoa everybody. Ko rangimotia te mātou manga teitei, ko awarua te awatapu, ko Ngāti Tānei te iwi toto, ko Pāmiti, tongarewa, manahiki, mangaia, ngō kotirana ahau, ko kai whakahaere ahau, ko Lizzie Makaleo tuko ingoa. Nice to spend the day with you all. There's our phone. Sorry.
All right, so real. This is life. Finish off, Lizzie? Have you finished? Ka pai. Awesome. Welcome. Thank you very much. Angie Tikanga. Oh, now I'm not going to be able to say it right, Angie, now that we've just talked about that. Tangieri from Community and Social Innovation in Auckland Council. Thanks very much for joining us today. Please tell us a bit about yourself too.
Nō reira, tēnā koutou katoa, ko hikurangi te maunga, ko waipu te awa, ko Ngāti Porou te iwi, te hei mauri ora. He mihi mahana kia tātou katoa e hui mai nei. Kia ora everybody, I'm Angie Tangairi, I'm Ngāti Porou, born and bred in South Auckland, and it's my privilege to be working alongside whānau to think about what we need to be doing differently to support our tamariki and whānau for better outcomes. Kia ora.
Awesome. Welcome, Angie. Lovely to have you here. And David Hanna, one of my long-standing Inspiring Communities and now Paradigm colleagues. Tēnā koe, hoa ki te pihi e koe. How are you today?
Tēnā pai. Morena tātou. I, David Hanna, part of the team at Inspiring Communities with a few little connections there to Wesley Community Action. And I'm based here in Te Whanganui Atara, the power capital of Aotearoa, or question mark.
Question mark. Aye. Ngā mihi, David. Welcome to all three of you, and let's get started. We only have an hour to talk through, but firstly, participants, we invite you to pause and consider, when was the last time you experienced a sense of powerlessness? Might have been in your professional life or in your personal life. What happened? What did it feel like? What did you do about it? If anything, it can be really hard to do something about it. And for some of us, this might be a recent experience, a frequent experience. But for some of us, it may well be difficult to pinpoint. And that's part of what we want to talk about today. So we ask you to hold yourself in that space, thinking about your own personal experiences, your professional experiences, as we listen to Lizzie, Angie and David this morning, and consider, where does the power lie in our worlds? On whose terms am I participating? quite difficult to see sometimes. David, community-led development, let's kick off with that. It has its share of power concentrations, doesn't it? But it also has flow, right, as everything does. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, kia ora, Denise. I mean, I guess mine is the sort of most abstract, but I just want to give a little bit of some frameworks to help us have this conversation and link the concept of power into what happens in local communities. So this first slide, this is often the go-to slide I find in communities and inspiring communities, because really this slide just reminds us that we're part of nature. And this is just sort of the eco-cycle, you know, and things have their growth and then they have they reach their point and they sort of either diminish or die and they get reformed or rebirthed before there's a next wave. And I guess the key thing when we look at that, as you said, it's about flow or ho water. It's the flow of energy through that. And it's a dynamic process. And if we have blocks in that process, if power gets concentrated in certain places, then we get some dis-ease. We're not a healthy system. So I think that understanding of the eco-cycle or the Panaki cycle reminds us about a really important, the flow, the forming of power and the releasing of power and reforming is a continuous movement in community organizations, in community, in streets, in neighborhoods, te mea. So next slide. So building on this, click. What we've learned in Wesley Community Action and Inspiring Communities is that there's a number of key touchstones, or ngā matapono, that guide this process, that sort of really help prevent power getting concentrated. And if you look at these principles in relation to power, I think they're quite insightful. So about growing shared local visions. This doesn't mean everyone's got the ability to shape the vision. How often is it that visions are defined by a small clique or group of people that are the same group that define visions? That we build strengths. One great way to disempower people, and Wellington bureaucracy does that very well, is to negatively label people by what they can't do, by all their defaults, their deficits, their high and complex needs, they're hard to reach. And that's just a process of disempowering. So we're going to understand their capabilities and their strengths. The third one is around work with diverse people and sectors. How often do we go to community forums where key parts of the forums are excluded? They're not at the table. So we've actually got to challenge ourselves about that. Grow collaborative local leadership. Again, often when we have local initiatives, we ask people like me, the managers or people in leadership roles in organizations to the table. When what we understand from this process is that there's this whole level of leadership, flax roots leadership, that is often invisible, that is actually exercising leadership in local communities. So understanding that empowers, bring them into focus. And the last one, learn by doing. We know that knowledge is power. And how often are there systems that concentrate knowledge in places that hold the power? So from a community-led development approach, we want the knowledge to be shared and for us to learn by doing it. No one person or group has the answer, the solution, or the knowledge. So I think all these principles help sort of open up this concept of power and get it flowing around the system. So if we link this together, this is where we come back to what we call our theory of change, you know, and it's really good to look at that from a power lens, you know, so that as you sort of move around those sort of continuous cycles, as you move around from loose connections to the capacity to act, to the capacity to organize, we're actually growing the capacity in communities, in groups of people, you know, it's never a straight line process. And as that happens, communities reclaim, strengthen their power and capacity to either tackle a problem or to really make the most of an opportunity, you know, and that's critical. So when you put this all together, you get the next slide, which actually has that whole movement of groups of people as they empower themselves to impact. So the flow and sharing of power is critical for this approach to have any influence and to impact on change. And equally, the hoarding and blocking of power actually undermines positive outcomes. And so that last step around collaboration, that sometimes requires sitting at the table with people that we don't normally sit at the table with. They may be people we don't like, or we disagree with them. And so something needs to happen for us to be able to be in that space and feel safe and okay. You know, so that's sort of one illustration we have. And then I've got a few just sort of quick hints that I want to offer to sort of finish with. So these are sort of my personal reflections, because it's easy to talk about this in a theoretical sense, and it all sounds all abstract and sweet. But in reality, this gets right into the core of who I am, you know, and I have deep learnings about my own ways of operating and the whole way I exercise and act out of my privilege, you know. So I've got a few dot points here that sort of tries to capture some of those insights. That we need to move away from focusing on power only based on those people in authority or on access to resources. I mean, I'm the director of an organization. I'm at the top of the pinnacle, you know. That doesn't, you know, so the system says supposedly I have power. We've got to really begin to restructure and rethink. The whole impact of historical injustice, you know, the whole colonization, whole waves of things actually embed things in our current institutions. So it's not a level playing field. So if we send out a standard invite to a forum and a whole group of people don't get there, it's probably a reflection of that historical imbalance. So we've really got to privilege, we've got to shift that and privilege groups that the institutions are designed to exclude. So all of us need to feel comfortable in that space, but sometimes it means sitting at the table with people we're not used to sitting at the table with. And that's a really, for me, that's been a really, you know, rich learning process. And at times I'm right out of my comfort zone. So in a sense, for myself, you know, here I am, Pākehā, male, in a leadership role, university educated, heterosexual, you know, I could list the world and communities designed for humans like me, not only in Aotearoa, but on a global scale. So actually going on this journey, there's some, I've got to be open to some honest reflection, for some hard feedback, and at times letting go of some assumptions or ways I work, you know? So that's part of that creative crisis. You know, people like me, there's a letting go process in there, which is, you know, it's got its edge, but it's also incredibly enriching. And just finally, just to offer that in that process, for those groups that have been traditionally excluded, there's also a challenge to not just have an us-them binary operation view that they're the enemy and we're the, you know, because in this next model of what we want to create, we've got to be respectful of everybody's journey and stuff in that. So there's some, that binary sort of us and them paradigm is something I think as we evolve, we've got to move beyond. So that's some really quick thoughts for me. Hope that's not too much. And that's something, an event that potentially Lizzie will pick up later on. But that's it for me, Denise.
Awesome. Thanks, David. I really like your point about being open to change and both sides, as it were, of the binary and dissolving the binary, if you like, which is easier said than done, like you were saying about theory, right? The how, and if we had time, we'd go into an example. But as you say, Lizzie will pick up this one in a little while, because I think it's those practical things that make a difference. It's easy to get paralyzed by paralysis by analysis, just thinking, how do I do this, and not getting on. But Angie, your work has been at the coalface of doing things, right? Doing things differently and from within a system, which is a pretty traditional system that privileges people like David, perhaps more than other people. How, in your experience, can we support the development of the conditions that share power, you know, that change those things, all those shifts, the conditions that even begin to deal with, for want of a better term, things like colonization, but also rampant capitalism, you know, a whole bunch of things that are disempowering. Tell us what the kōrero is bringing up for you and how we might do some of that stuff. What's happening in Tamaki Makaurau?
Oh, kia ora tātou. I think the thing that was resonating was the principles that David was talking to in his presentation. I think you'll hear some of that echoed in how we approach our practice and our systems thinking around how we're sharing power. Yeah, so and also the binary nature of most of our institutions, processes, is also a challenge for us to think about how we're creating those conditions for there to be the space for the system to respond differently. But what I'd like to talk about today is give you some examples of how we're thinking consciously about power sharing in the practice as we work alongside whānau through an whānau innovation methodology, whānau-led innovation methodology, and also how we're thinking about it across system and across space, which is it will link to what David was talking about in terms of points of power being concentrated in points of the system. But just a little bit of background about who we are. So we are community and social innovation unit is the social and economic innovation capacity of Auckland Council. So our job is to think about what do we need to do differently to get different results for our whānau. So we know, for example, in South Auckland, for many of our whānau, current service provision and responses are not creating the outcomes or the positive impact that's required for our whānau to be well. So my job is to think about how I empower whānau to create their own local fit for purpose solutions, strength-based solutions for some of our most complex constructs, complex challenges within some of our most complex constructs. And so we're flipping the assumption that innovation and change is locked up, the capacity for that's locked up inside of institution, and we're saying we believe whānau and community can lead that innovation. And part of what I need to do in that is to check my own power and privilege too, as David was talking about, and to recognise the power of others and to support others recognising their own power and stepping into that power. And when I think about power for our whānau, I'm thinking about the capacity and the resources, or the ability to access resources for rangatiratanga for our whānau, for them to be autonomous. Also to think about sharing power makes you more powerful. It does not diminish your power, which is the traditional ideology of some of our power constructs and practices. So how do we model sharing power can make you more powerful rather than diminish your own power? So I'll just move to the next slide, which is about our methodology, and talk a little bit about the practice. We're using a Tikanga framework and design methodology to support whānau-led innovation here in South Auckland. And the reason why we use Tikanga as a starting point is, I believe, it's firstly, we need to contextualise anything that we're doing with our community so they can see themselves in it. But secondly, we're challenging rampant capitalism, neoliberalism, post-colonial thinking, and the way that we begin to talk about the values that are important to us. And Tikanga as a value set begin to indicate what's important in the practice and how we are in terms of relating to each other in the practice, but also what we value as outcomes, like whanaungatanga, like rangatiratanga. We use design, it helps us to grapple with the complexity of some of our biggest social and economic challenges. And what we also are trying to do is to hold and legitimise knowledge systems that have not traditionally been recognised by post-colonial institutions, constructs and thinking. So we're already trying to legitimise and share power by recognising knowledge systems, for example. If we move to the next slide, I'm going to just talk very quickly about how we use the framework in terms of guiding our practice. So it's the practice of the way we're supporting whānau, our innovation practice is underpinned by these key principles. But I just wanted to talk about two specifically, and that is to speak to tino rangatiratanga mana. And so, as David was talking about, people have to be in the visioning and being conscious about who's at the table and how we heard traditionally unheard voices. We're thinking about, when we're working with whānau, how they set the kawa for it, they set their own tikanga, and how we are accountable to that whānau, setting the parameters of the work, and also how we consciously flip who's making decisions in those processes. So who's making the decisions about the resources, how they're allocated, who's prioritising what we should be working on. And in my mind, good practice is that whānau and communities are making those decisions, and we're supporting the work. And the other thing is really acknowledging the inherent power and influence that whānau already have, and ensuring that we are very conscious about how we're sharing power in the process and how we're respecting whānau, their whakapapa, their connections, and their mana inside of that process as we're working together. And that means we're recognising them as the experts in their lives, and we're valuing their expertise. So whether that's koha or and supporting whānau to lead, we're consciously recognising that as we work with them inside of an innovation process. Lastly, if we move to the next slide, I'm really trying to stay to my 7 minutes, I'm pretty close. This is how we are conceptualising how you think about whether power in these different spaces is compounding in equity, or it's empowering our whānau to lead their own strength-based solutions. So we think about this across 3 spaces. I used to call them levels, I don't now. The reason I don't, and David makes a good point, is that people think the last ring is where the power sits, and it doesn't. Power sits in all of these spaces. We have to reimagine how we are working with that power in the spaces. So if we think about the first space, we're thinking about whānau and whānau outcomes. The way that we ask ourselves about how power is utilised is we're thinking, is this power being used to support and embed deficit intervention crisis responses, of which we do need, but also how is that power being enacted to support positive strength-based initiatives that are about the ecology of support for whānau, like social capital, like social networks, like safe spaces that whānau can be, and how are we supporting pro-social connections for our whānau inside of their community. When we go out to the next space, we're thinking about, is the power inside of system legitimising its own responses, legitimising itself, or are we able to start to open up spaces in systems that help support alternative responses, like indigenising responses, like indigenising process. And the last one is our big power construct. So that is government, economy, capitalism. How are those constructs acknowledging colonisation, intergenerational trauma, and how are they reconfiguring and rethinking the way that they can support whānau through those lenses? So that's how we've been thinking about it across system and space. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Seems like it's a whole lot more than conceptualizing power there. It's actually actualizing it as well, or a framework for actualizing it. It'd be great to hear some examples of that too. Angie, I really loved the genuine acknowledgement of the lived experience, almost becoming the system, if you like, flipping it around, not just weaving it in, because when we weave it in, it's still often under the auspices of the traditional power regime, if that makes any sense. So it was really heartening and good to hear that very condensed version. We'll have to have lots more conversation yet, but ka pai, thank you so much. I'm seeing that we're getting some questions coming in, people out in the room, and I forgot to introduce the lovely Rachel earlier, who's sitting there on your screen, who's helping in the back. And she'll be sending those questions through to me because I have them turned off later. Please do keep sending your questions through, and we'll come to those very soon. But before that, we have the lovely Lizzie. Lizzie, there are many pathways, are there not, to achieving change? I love what Angie was saying about people being at the decision-making table. So often we recruit, as David, or the system calls it, the hard to reach into our already made decisions. And we don't actually share that level of power at all. If anything, we might allow some, whoever the we is, some sharing of power at a action-taking level. But tell me what's going on in your world. How does power and participation and actually the power of people's potential get to shine where you are?
Yeah, cool. So I hope you can hear me, because I know I have had issues with my volume, but hopefully I'm nice and clear. I just wanted to use this picture in the background. There's a picture of a tree, and I wanted you all to like really listen to this, because to the left side of the tree, that's the world that, you know, everyone around me, myself, and everyone before me have kind of come from. And it's a world where you know, children have grown up in state wards. Well, you know, New Zealand's finest welfare establishments where the government has actually parented them. So therefore they've been fatherless, motherless. They've drifted through every system you can imagine, unloved, rejected, uneducated, no encouragement, no positive role models. You know, they've done it all, the life of poverty, the life of crime, but they've got really good survival skills, but they've also you know, violence has been an outlet for anger. And there's hundreds of individuals right across New Zealand who have been shaped by these environments and these experiences for decades. And you'll see the decades that I've put up there, and I'm sure they go back as far as the 60s, you know, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now we're in the 2000s. So this, to me, has started a culture. There is a really strong culture that sits across New Zealand, and some people might refer to that as the gang culture, maybe, but it is there, you know. But in my eyes, it's a culture of survivors. It's a culture of people who have lived a lifelong recession, and they are most resilient and they are most powerful. Maybe not in the way that people think, but they are so powerful and they are shaped by their culture. So my thing is, how do you begin to think outside your own culture? If you have never been exposed to anything else but your culture, you know, your upbringing, your environment, the way you do things, your whānau do things, and you have not been exposed to anything else, what comes of that? You know, there's some food for thought there. So if we think about our gang whānau or club whānau, they are a growing culture. They are a culture that our government has not actually been able to dismantle. That's powerful. It's been decades and they are still there and they are bigger than before, you know. So the thing is, yeah, they come from communities that are ravaged in hardship, poverty, crime, violence. So you got to wonder, why can't we shift or change this culture? Because the whānau continue to be shaped by their environments. And I'm a big believer that people are shaped by their environments. So can we go to slide 2? And this is a really good example. And I thank you to Justice Joe Williams for allowing me to show this again. But, you know, you are what you are exposed to. And the William brothers are perfect examples. They are both leaders and they both have power and potential. Now, I knew John Boy. I grew up with John Boy in the mob, and we were really good friends. He was such a powerful man who stood, you know, where he stood. Later on, I've come to meet Justice Joe, and he is also a very powerful man. They are brothers, biologically related, total different environments, total different upbringings. Can we go to the next slide, please? So, you know, I thought, yeah, this picture does it for me every time. The Hickeys and the Brady bunch. Whānau need to be exposed to different environments or different ways of doing things that will influence and challenge their thinking or change their thinking. They need to be allowed to participate in opportunities, you know, where they actually get to think twice about something and enjoy something in their life, doing it a different way. I think we sit too much on the punishing, you know, like at the moment, what's her name in the blue? Collins, Jennifer Collins. She just wants to punish. Every time I hear her think, it's just punish, you know, punish. But you actually need to sit back and figure out how this culture works. And what I know about our whānau, and I'm sure this is probably all the club whānau across Aotearoa, when you're listening and you're trying to learn to something, you only hear what relates back to your background. So when I hear things that are related to my background, man, my ears are up and I am listening and I'm I'm sure that's with everybody else in their own backgrounds and cultures. So they're not going to listen to other ways of doing things that don't fit within, you know, their way of doing. So we need to begin to rethink. We need to include the whānau, and we need to think about how can you change a culture you know nothing about. You know, if you don't know about a culture, you go and research it and you learn about it, don't you? And we will never ever turn the Hekies into the Brady Bunch. It just doesn't work like that. So I believe, yep, we all belong to a culture, and maybe this is quite strong. We're all victims of culture, but we are all victims of our own culture because we've all had different upbringings. We come from different communities. There are different levels of people. And I really think that it's time for the government to really begin to understand this. You know, I also have a parenting program that myself and a colleague created ourselves, and we did put the Heki whānau in the middle of that when we created it for them. In that we speak about, you know, catching your tamariki being good and growing that, rather than focusing on what they're doing wrong and unconsciously growing that. I think it's the same across the board. If we catch people doing good, we need to jump on that stuff, you know, but we always want to catch everyone doing bad. And I don't know if anybody knows the difference between punishment and discipline. It's another kōrero we have. Punishment means you're a bad person. Bugger off to the dungeon and I don't want to see you again because you're bad. Discipline, you offer a learning opportunity. You know, with our children, we don't punish them anymore. We need to offer them a chance to do it again and learn from that. So I don't know, but every person has falls from the system, and there's a lot of them, and it goes right back to maybe primary school and so forth. They fall out of a system, they're going to go on to look for another system, you know, and that system ain't going to be in the government. So if we're going to create change and we want to think about power, I do believe we need to go right back to the beginning and strip it back. And that's kind of it for me.
Ka pai. Thank you, Lizzie. It's a similar things, isn't it? It's about sharing power. Doesn't diminish your power, but it comes from different places, and we see what we're looking for. We hear what we're listening for. So we're looking for our own culture, and we have to be open to change. Whoever, both sides or the non-binary many sides being open. That's a real challenge, I think. And how do we actually learn to share power? What are some examples there? You know, it seems to me that you're all saying sharing power empowers all of us. And sometimes hugely, you know, at the same time, we have agency and can join together. And the other thing it seems to me that you're saying is that we're better together. You know, actually our differences, we don't have to all be the same. We can't be, actually, and that's the reality as well. But we can join together to amplify agency, including agency for change. So what do we do? What are the practical things about getting systems to change power or to share power? And how do we change the systems we're in and part of, because we're part of it. We're part of perpetuating it or not. So what do we grow here? Who would like to answer the question?
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in. I don't mind jumping in if that's okay. And just to put it out there, I do work for Wesley Community Action, and I am based in Porirua, and I do work in my hometown, Waitangirua. So I've been here since 2009 working in the community, and over that time, I have done a lot of mahi in the space of my own gang whānau, because I have been based here. And I think, like that space of power, it is like we've done so much over the years. You know, we started a play group, Te Whare Takaro, with the woman from the mob, like 25 women. We then became the mumsies. But in these things, the women have shaped everything. We've just provided a space, really. And I think that's the key. Here's the space. Let's get together. What do we want to see happen? I think the biggest thing at that time that happened was a lot of the women had children that had passed away. We had partners that have died. There's a lot of suffering through alcohol and violence and death. So we actually created an event called Life Without You. It was a Memorial Day. And this allowed the woman in the region to come together, acknowledge the men that have passed away, but it was actually paid tribute to the babies and the children that have died and gone. And it was a day to let go of their pain and to heal. And I think that's something we don't do enough of, is let's acknowledge stuff and let's do the healing, because until that happens, you can't really move on. You're stuck in that rut. But, you know, after that has come Real Talk, which is the parenting program. We've got Mama Celia's, again, as another walk-in for anyone in the community to come in and let's shape this together. Every day, every time we run it, it's got a different flavour to it, because we don't know what's walking in the door. You know, NZ People was a movement, and that's a movement with 8,000 people right across New Zealand. I've been able to hand that movement over this year because it's so strong and powerful. It's got its own voice and it's moving across New Zealand. You know, there's been a lot of stuff that Wesley have done in the club scenes as well. And David, you know, you've organised a lot of these things where I think I'll always be inspired by our first interaction with Notorious Gang, where we had on club. We had, I think it was 80 patch members, all of the Wesley staff. We came together over a weekend, but you know what? We came together as parents. We came together as people. We didn't come together as us and them. And I remember that, because it was like, wow, we're really doing this. And it was one of the coolest things. And that relationship grew from there. So, you know, there's a lot of things that we have done. And in the community, we did used to get lots of pots of gold fall from the sky. We did get the community in. I'll hit it up on the Porirua page and say, whānau, let's get together and design something. Let's do something for the tamariki. And whoever wants to come in, we'll walk in the door, we plan it, we design it, we run it, and then, hey, come back and clean up. But, you know, it's involving them. People are not thick and they're not stupid.
Total.
If you give them an opportunity, they are the most powerful to do.
Yeah. Absolutely. You know? David, you're busting to add to this, kōrero.
No, I just think, just to highlight or emphasize what Lizzie's saying, some really practical, sort of simple steps, which is around just creating space which is flexible. And we've got to let go of this over-structured program approach, you know? So if we can have sort of shared space or public space where people who have got ideas or just want to have some discussions or vent, doing that is a good thing. And also when they come up with suggestions or ideas, be really open to that, you know, like, so there's, you know, I think those, they sound really simple, but they are actually aspects of allowing people to step into their power. So that's, I just wanted to sort of highlight some really
totally practical. I think really valid points. Angie, I'm sure you've got something to add.
Yeah, and I can see some questions, and
yeah, we'll go to those soon.
Yeah, I just want to answer this and add on to what Lizzie and David are saying, and that is the way we've been thinking about how we do that inside of system. Number one, healing is incredibly powerful, and it is not acknowledged or resourced as a key way of being well.
Absolutely.
And I just want to acknowledge that. I think that's true to say. That's come out in some of our work recently. But the way we've been thinking about how we share power or think about power differently inside a system and beside it is, for example, we've been doing some work led by the Social Wellbeing Board here in South Auckland, which is incredibly helpful in terms of coordinating and integrating how systems can support whānau in crisis. And also our work has been to be inside of that system and understand how the responses could be indigenised or where the alternative responses could lie within systems. So instead of it being you're referred to a provider or not, there's a report of concern or not, that's what we're talking about in terms of binary. We're rethinking what else can sit alongside and support whānau as a systems response. That's number one. So lobbying for and modelling what that could look like so that people inside the system can see it working.
Yeah.
They've got to know how it's very hard for people to reimagine outside of their own system and responsive. So that's the sort of system innovation and thinking about how we use power differently inside the system. The second thing is that, and this is my passion, is that we're working whānau for the innovation to be whānau-led and it's beside the system. And so that is truly strength-based and tikanga-led and whānau-led. And so we're working the two at the same time simultaneously, and both are learning from each other. And I think that's really important because we're all trying to, there's a lot of work for us to redesign service, redesign process, redesign system, and that's great. And also we need to be doing supporting and reconfiguring our resources to how whānau are telling us they need to be supported or how they want to support each other.
Yeah, really good points there, Angie. Actually, everybody really good points, and that does answer, I hope, some of the question about the concept of the binary being dismantled. Someone was asking that following the treaty is by necessity a binary process, as there were two key parties to the treaty, and the balance between the two needs to be redressed, which is, I think, partly what you're saying, absolutely what you're saying, actually. But does anyone else want to have any comment around explaining the concept of the binary being dismantled? Any other thoughts on that before we move? Yeah, David.
Well, I mean, I thought it was a really, good, powerful question about Te Riti and that in terms of the binary. And I think it's and. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of binary relationships. And so if you look at the treaty process, different iwi, different hapu had really different understandings and responses to the Te Riti. Some signed, some didn't. And also, if you look at the Crown, there was different views and different perspectives between the different actors in that process. So what looks like a big binary process between two, when you look into it, there's a whole lot of more complexity. And I think a process that enables us to understand that rich complexity is a way that, and if we can able to sort of distribute power, I think that's a healthier system and process to go down. Whereas if we just simplify it down into sort of either or, we've done a big injustice to the richness of human systems.
Sorry, Denise, can I just clarify? When I'm talking about binary, I'm talking about the binary nature of process and institution. I'm not talking about binary relationship. I'm talking about how our systems process things in a binary nature. It's one way or the other. What David's touching on, I think, is right, because those binary processes are never underpinned by relationship. They're only underpinned by process, and that's our challenge. One of the most powerful things I think we can do in terms of systems change is to create the spaces where these lived realities are coming together and figuring out how they're going to support each other for a better outcome. So some of the stuff that we do is we have systems leaders and whānau in the same space, sharing and working together, and in a space where we're all powerful. We've got equal power, we've got equal control in the space. And that's unusual for us in this day and age.
Yeah, but it's a similar concept to what Lizzie was saying about holding space, creating space to come together. So, different actors, if you like, in those spaces, but retaining and amplifying power by working together, coming together as community, not necessarily for community even, because you're part of it. The complexity argument is totally there, or explanation. So I'm going to go on to some of the questions now. I think Rachel's feeding them to me, so I'm just looking at my other screen here. And thinking about the modelling of power, I think was a really powerful thing that you said, Angie, because that's one way people can see. It's really hard to reimagine things, as you're saying, Lizzie, not just from the system, but from your culture. This is what you know. So systems and culture, not quite interchangeable, but very closely related in some ways anyway. So we've got a question here, a couple of questions that are related about how widespread are the principles Angie was talking about in Auckland Council. So not just in Auckland Council, I think, but how widespread are I saw that, Angie. How widespread are those principles in our systems, but particularly perhaps in Auckland Council? Do you know how will your processes accommodate Tamaki Makoto's emerging age-friendly city initiative? So a specific question around that, but I think, so we can answer that perhaps if you do know how, but thinking about those principles, how widespread are they? Angie, do you want to go first and answer the specific question?
About the strategy?
Yeah, about the age-friendly city initiative.
I'm afraid I don't know much about the strategy. You'll understand that an institution of this size has many strategies and many departments doing their best to support communities. I don't understand the implications of the strategy, but what I'd say is my job is to put the lived experience of whānau and their capacity and capability to lead their own change first, understand what they're saying will make a difference, build their capability, or just support them to do what they can already do because they're resilient as. And then my job is to figure out how the rest of what the offering of my institution and other agencies is to support that. So it's not about figuring out, I may be aware of some key strategies or documents that are going to support whānau. It's not about me carrying all of the strategies of Auckland Council into a whānau-led innovation process, but it is my job to understand once whānau have articulated what they want, how I leverage my own, how I disrupt my own institution, leverage my own institution in terms of the resources and expertise available to support what they've said. So it's flipping it from going, how do we achieve our strategy, our Auckland Council strategy, to how are we supporting the whānau-led innovation with all of that we bring as Auckland Council.
Really good answer there. Totally right. David, what would you like to add to that?
Oh, no, I was just going to briefly add, and as in your reframing of the question, Denise, that the principles that the three of us are talking about, how evident are they in a lot of the dominant systems, be they local government or central government or other things? And, you know, my impression is that they're not common, that we've actually had, you know, a number of years of a sort of neoliberal approach to policy making and ways of trying to fix problems that mean that the sort of this knowledge is sort of ebbed out of the system. At the same time, there's massive influences sort of at a national and global level where these are popping up in all sorts of different contexts, you know, be it in ecological, climate change, challenging the justice system and the policing system, you know.
COVID, right?
Exactly, all that stuff. So I think it's all just sort of bubbling there underneath the surface. And I think that's exciting. And at the same time, it can be frustrating because a lot of the big systems are really struggling with using the old way of operating with the emerging issues.
So I guess that brings us into a how question again, because some people, the system works for them. They don't want to share power and they can't be convinced either. In fact, sharing power has not worked for them, hasn't got them to where they are. Other ways of getting there have done. So it's a really quite a big thing to challenge and change, right? How do we change it at a practical level? Anyone?
Well, I mean, I think there's a whole range of ways. If we can each do our own reading and open ourselves up, you know, in one sense, it can just be what we read, our sources of information, you know, and also, you know, for me, and Lizzie referred to that memorial event for the Mumsies organised, you know, I attended that with my family, you know, that was right out of our comfort zone. You know, we were the little Pākehā family there in the middle of, you know, of the mob whānau, you know, but a beautiful learning experience, absolutely rich, you know. So I guess we've all got opportunities to keep, you know, open for.
What do you? Yeah, and I totally agree. Being open is one thing, and as Angie was saying, checking our own privilege and using our privilege to ally perhaps is another way. Lizzie, you were having a little giggle then. And what do you think?
Oh, yeah, I was just picturing David and his whānau. I mean, you know, there's a lot of things that are happening within a lot of whānau across New Zealand that they don't make for good media stories, so people are not aware of a lot of things that are happening across the country. You know, there's these new generations now that have come through, and some of them have got some really good leaders as well. But yeah, I think, I don't know, how do you begin? You got to begin with changing your own thinking, I suppose, and, you know, figure out how do you build positive relationships with whānau and stop seeing the bad stuff and start trying to see the potential that people do have in their communities and figure out how to grow that rather than condemn everyone to the bloody dungeon all the time. Like, you've really got to change your whole approach. I think no matter what club, whether it's a sports club or, you know, whatever kind of club, you've always got your good and your bad apples in there, and that's a human thing. And it's the same with the gang club, you know. They're no different to anybody else, and there are plenty of other Kiwis that go to jail, commit crime, sell drugs, do all that stuff that are not in gangs, but gangs are good media stories, so they're thrown in there. So, you know, you just, yeah, you got to try and get to know people in your community, and then you'll begin to see the good. I see it every day, you know, like right throughout the country. I've got plenty of Facebook connections with lots of different whānau. There is some amazing stuff going on, man.
You're so right. There is amazing stuff going on, and some of it, but not very much, makes it to the media. There's also lots of stereotyping, right?
Yeah,
and the real experience is that some people go to jail for things that other people don't go to jail for, the same thing. So there's a whole lot of system stuff there. That's power, right? It reminds me of the quadrants of change, which came from the peace building literature, you know, that you have power over yourself and how you undertake your relationships. And some of us have some power over the structures and the systems and culture as well. It all sort of comes together. I'm wondering what you're thinking, Angie, around this whole idea of how do we actually do it? Because putting it only on the shoulders of individuals, especially those that don't have power, is a bit like telling us that it's our business to stop climate change. You know, it actually needs the systems to change too. What are your thoughts?
That's a very, very good question. And there's a question about with power comes responsibility. Sorry, there was a comment. And I think that is very real in this practice. And so, I mean, I feel an immense sense of responsibility for my community. This is why I do this work. And as we push into innovation and try different things, there are ethical considerations around the types of things we're asking whānau to participate. And that might be in systems change work when we haven't been able to achieve that. But my experience of the work, and I know there's a comment about, you know, people's time and capability and community. My experience is people, our whānau here in South Auckland, is they want to make a difference. They want to make a difference for their kids. It's the invitation that we're extending to whānau about how we are working together and the relationships that we build to be able to do that. That's my experience. We're always saying things like they're too busy, they've got too much on, they haven't got enough money, they haven't got enough time. My experience is they are very motivated to do better for themselves and better for their children. It's the way that we're sharing power, inviting people into the process, that's the barrier. Yeah, so that's what we consciously think about.
Yeah, no, that's great. And it kind of hopefully goes some way to answering a question. I'm not looking at the chat, I'm just looking at what Rachel's feeding me. But there's a question or a comment there about talking about diversity, about ensuring that the systems we create are agile enough to shift into the whānau system rather than the other way around. And so, yeah, that's sort of what you're saying, right? How do you do that though, Angie? How is that doing? Give us some examples.
Yeah, I can give you a quick example. So the way we think about that is how we're creating the space for the work to happen, which is safe for our whānau and safe for the people in the system to be able to do some of this disruption. Because people think it sounds great and it's fun. The reality is innovation is really hard grind. And you have to put a lot of yourself on the line to do it. So we think about how we carefully support creating the conditions for whānau to feel safe, and that's why we use our tikanga principles. So our tikanga principles are they are cultural principles that are based on the work of kaupapa Māori research and methodology practice. And it's about how you curate those conditions where whānau are telling you what's going to keep them safe, what they need out of it, and what they want to achieve, as well as being able to make the systems actors to come into the space and support a whānau-led process. For me, very practical things. We do things like, when you come into the room, I'm Angie and I live in Pabukura. The fact that I work in Auckland Council, it might help us, might not. We're all equal in what we contribute, and we're very, very clear about that as system actors come into the space. Everybody in the room is powerful. Everybody in the room has expertise, and we're all equally valued in how we contribute.
And you're modeling that from the get-go, right? Putting the Auckland Council title down the list, not mentioning it first. David, I'm going to do a bit of a wrap-up, so you have your comment as a final comment, if that's okay, because I'm just mindful of time now. Really, really grateful for all of the comments in the chat, and not that I've seen them, but I'm very grateful that they're there. I can see there are quite a few. But also really, really grateful for everybody's time and your real honesty today as we've talked about this as well. Just let's have a couple of final words before we sort of sign off. Lizzie, what would you like to say to everyone as we close up this session?
I guess I'd just like to say, like, you know, have a really good think about what's been said today, and think about what is the difference you can make for whānau out there. What is it that you can actually do in your role that will actually make an impact for whānau? Because it's time to change. Just moving forward, it's got to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It won't start unless we start, right? And so we have agency over ourselves. David, what are your final words for us today?
Well, maybe if I just pick up one of the questions or comments that someone fed in about maybe a forum like this is preaching to the converted, you know, and I'm sure it is. I think that's totally right. And my sort of final comment is, if all of us as the converted actually got energized and mobilized and did what we can, wherever we can, whatever we've got, then what we do is we help grow the social movement. And it's going to be a social movement that's every significant power shift in human civilization has come about from a social movement of people actually seeking something better and acting differently. So
let's
this process energizes us to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, lovely. Angie, a couple of final words.
Just to say, I acknowledge all of the wonderful work that's happening across Aotearoa and my colleagues on the panel today, and to the people who are listening. I know there's many amazing things that are happening, and just know that we're sharing this practice in the spirit of support for whānau and our colleagues to be able to do this work. Mine is to be really conscious about how you are exercising your power and privilege, and how we're thinking about how we can flip what we would usually be doing as an institution, as a bureaucrat, as a practitioner, and just be consciously reflecting on your own practice and how we can be actively sharing power.
Awesome. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, David. That's really good. Just participants, a sort of snapshot really that we can do in an hour of talking about this very important kōrero, and hopefully you've taken something out of it and also reflected on your own experiences of being powerful and being perhaps less powerful at different times. I'm going to just close this up now. Our community innovation webinar series has been hugely successful in 2020, and we're now looking ahead to 2021 to help frame up what you want to hear from us in support of your mahi. So echoing what Angie was just saying, actually, in the next few weeks, you'll receive an opportunity to provide us with your ideas, your thoughts and feedback, and what you would like to see pulled together as a collective online kōrero for the next year. So please look out for that and let us know. This is how we can actually create some space online to share some of this stuff as well, and hopefully make some changes, or at least contribute to those things. Even among the converted, as David says, we can be powerful when we work together. So following on from this webinar, we recommend that you tap into one of our free one-to-one community-led development clinics if you're really interested in taking it further in your space. A lot of what we've talked about today has been the power of us as individuals and how we undertake our own mahi and our relationships. Those are free and they're available right through to the end of the year. They're 1-hour clinics that can provide you with access to expert advice on specific tools and practices relevant to what you're doing. So have a look on the website and you can see how to book it there. And lastly, you might have discovered how Inspiring Community's new consultancy is of what Paradigm is now. It's really focused on bridging the gaps that sit across our existing systems. There are heaps of gaps, there are heaps of strengths too. It's working with those strengths to bridge those gaps and to distribute power more equitably by working in collaborative ways and working to strengths. We're really about powering up your capability and local and national connections in support of better project and community outcomes. So have a look at that. If you're interested in working in this space and having things change in your space, then talk to us. That would be awesome to hear from you. I hope you've enjoyed our conversation today. We'll share a recording and slides from this session soon, so if you've registered, you'll get that, and I think it goes up on Facebook as well. But for now, I really offer my thanks again to the panel for sharing so much in such a short time too with us, and thank you to all of those of you who are here today, who have attended today, and for your thoughtful questions. Thanks too to those who gave us time to talk about their experience and share insights as we've developed various writing that go alongside this. And I'll close us with a karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te urutapa nui, ke wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairoa e te ara tangata. Koe rā e rongo, whakaaria, aki ki runga, kia tina, tina, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Go well, everybody. See you next time. Mā te wā.